Kingsley helps us to understand the beginning of the incredibly subtle and sophisticated esoteric poem by the 5th century pre-Socratic philosopher/mystic Empedocles, when he addresses his pupil Pausanias and says, quote, "If you press my words down underneath your dense packed diaphragm." Kingsley understands the meaning of this portion of the phrase as a command to breathe Empedocles' words, quote, "deeply into your belly. Then they will stay with you, and they will grow, and they will change you." Christ's parable of the sower similarly uses this imagery of planting seeds into the earth and cultivating its growth in order for it to sprout within you into giant trees, an entirely organic process. Empedocles' words, it would seem, must be planted or pressed deep down and underneath your dense packed diaphragm. The word diaphragm is translated from the ancient Greek word phrenes. Let us dig a little deeper into the word phrenes, which is a complicated term, and its incredible applicability to various psychological states for Homeric man. Fundamentally, we do not know where the origin of the word derives from, but it certainly predates Homer, and in fact, there's considerable evidence that it morphed into its current meaning by the time Homer came to use it in his Iliad and Odyssey. The singular form is phren, and it sometimes occurs as a singular entity, but it most often occurs in the poems in the plural, hence phrenes. In the monograph entitled Psychological Activity in Homer, the authors set out to outline all the multiple occurrences of phrenes in Homer's works, in order to try to elucidate a more accurate description of the role of phrenes and how it was understood. What they essentially came to was the conclusion that phren is not only a psychic faculty, but also a physical one. Hence, the authors defined it ambiguously as, quote, "a faculty indeterminately corporeal." We will explore in a little bit more detail the instances of phrenes with its various manifestations, but it is interesting to draw a parallel with the ancient Hindu tradition that speak of chakras, residing along the vertical axis of the human body. It has been researched quite extensively that ancient Greeks and ancient Indian civilizations cross-fertilized for many thousands of years, negating the presumption that Greek civilization was isolated, self-generated. In fact, there is considerable evidence of a common origin, so it is not an unimaginable leap of logic to see a transference of these notions of the subtle physiology. In fact, a faculty indeterminately corporeal does suggest a subtle body aspect, something akin to the chakras, which are both localized areas of visualization for the mind, as well as physical locations that harness energy of a particular sort. By the 5th century, around the time Empedocles lived, phrenes came to denote the diaphragm. The organ is responsible for breathing and allows you to inhale and exhale, and is anatomically located on the floor of the thoracic cavity and the ceiling of the abdominal cavity. When you inhale, your diaphragm contracts and increases space in your thoracic cavity so that your lungs can expand to take in air. As it relaxes, it reduces the space in the thoracic cavity, effectively compressing the lungs for exhalation. In the writings of Homer and the anonymous authors of the Hippocratic or Corpus, the precise location of the phrenes were very vague. It could be located in the diaphragm, lungs, pericardium, which is the muscle surrounding the heart, or simply as a composite of psychic entities that were generally found in the chest region. Now, it's important to note that this is not simply the outer casing of the chest, because that area is denoted by the stheia, hence the medical tool of the stethoscope, which is applied to the chest when a doctor wants to listen to one's heartbeat or lungs. In the Iliad, the physical aspect of phren is mentioned on 3 separate instances. 1, phrenes, quotes, encloses the heart about. 2. Phrenes, quote, follows a spear that is drawn from the chest when a weapon is extricated from it. And also 3. Phrenes hold the liver. Phrenes, however, is not just physical, as we just mentioned. They act as both agents and functions. It is an agent in the sense that it is the seat of thinking, feeling, and willing. In some passages in the Iliad, for example, when Paris is deemed handsome but has, quote, no strength or courage in his phrenes, the phrenes represent the person's inner thoughts or the quality of their character. Another instance is when Odysseus says that the gods do not give, quote, form, phrenes, or eloquence to all men. This suggests phrenes as an inner capacity that is granted to us from the divine. Broadly speaking, the psychological component of phrenes can be classified as emotional, intellectual, moral, and volitional. In the emotional sense, phrenes can contain positive emotions like joy and courage, as well as negative emotions like grief, anger, rage, fear, and pain. Intellectually, phrenes allow a person to recognize a situation by recognizing another person or a meaning of an event. For example, Zeus recognizes in his phrenes the meaning of the silence of Athena and Hera, or Odysseus fears that Athena is deceiving his phrenes so that he will perceive a situation incorrectly. I will speak more later about Aphrodite's and love's effect on the phrenes and her cosmic play of illusion and disorientation in the weaving of reality. Phrenes also allows us to reason about situations or devise certain plans, as well as decision-making. In the Homeric epics, when a person ponders or makes considerations, then the location of these are in the phren and thymos. The assumption is that a person still has a freedom of choice to decide between one possibility or another, but ultimately, the influence of the choice in the first place presented within the phrenes can be induced by a divine messenger. Phrenes also act as receivers. To refer back to the initial command by Empedocles, quote, if you press my words down underneath your dense packed diaphragm, that command implies that the listener's phrenes should act as a receiving agent. So the phrenes are receiving specific things, in this case, words, but they can also include deeds, orders, songs, and intentions. A deity can also, quote, place it in the phrenes of a human recipient in order to perform an action or keep some intention or understanding. It's important to keep in mind that Empedocles had famously declared that he had become a god. So in a sense, the conveying of the poem by Empedocles to his pupil Pausanias is the transmission not necessarily between a mortal to another mortal, but an immortal to a mortal. You will not comprehend the meaning of this mortality and immortality based on the common assumptions that we make about these two states of being. In order to get a more differentiated notion of what is mortal and what is immortal, I highly recommend reading Empedocles' work, or the article entitled Embryological Analyses in Empedocles' Cosmology by F.A. Wilford. This is a learning, or an acting, that results from placing words in the phrenes. The parable of the sower is particularly apt in this demonstration, as the diaphragm or phrenes represent analogically the earth that acts as a boundary before the subterranean darkness that resides within the bowels of the human body, and the bowels of the earth, the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm and vice versa. When you are planting and cultivating words into the darkest region of your body, you are effectively planting seeds that, if fostered rightly with love and care and attention, will grow and bloom into a tree, a cosmic tree whose axis bridges both types of cosmos. Take note of the later Plato's and Socrates' notion of the human being as an inverted tree whose roots reside in heaven and whose flowering and branching out occur here on earth. This is precisely the reflection of that at the level of the microcosmic body. There is a profound esoteric truth with respect to the inverted tree and the branching of the bronchi of the lungs as it descends toward the phrenes and from there beyond, but we'll keep silent on this point for now. If you wonder about the state of youth and the condition of their phrenes in terms of their sometimes questionable behavior and decision-making, have no illusions any longer, for Agamemnon has stated that the phrenes of the youth are, quote, floating in the air. Many of these traits and capabilities that endow the noble aspects to one's character located within phrenes seems to come with old age and an assumption of the acquisition of wisdom. Phrenes is also associated with speech, both as a source and as a receiver. For example, a person may be able to know how to speak things appropriately in or with his or her phrenes. It also functions as a receptacle, where words are kept, considered, or understood. Again, this speaks to Empedocles' command of Pausanias in the esoteric poem. This again shows that another being, whether mortal or immortal, can place words into the phrenes of someone else. Additionally, it has a function with regard to memory or remembering, perhaps in a sense of a true anamnesis of origins. Empedocles seems to be invoking a subtle organ that inspires a remembering of the ontos, the beginning, reality, the being, and the origin of all such things. His poem is speaking about the origin of humanity and simultaneously the cosmos. Similarly, phrenes is affected by the words of others and can be persuaded by the speech of others. It can also fail to be affected by the speech of others. In this instance, he is preparing his pupil to become receptive to the words and knowledge he is about to impart. As I've shown, phrenes has a multitude of nuance and subtlety in terms of its functions and operations. Appended to this, phrenes is also associated with desiring, hoping, forgetting, eagerness, desire for food, shame, respect, courage, vigor, so on and so on. In order to function properly, the phrenes requires the presence of psyche within the body. The psyche somehow functions as its animating or vitalizing principle, the breath of ether or wind, a culmination of the four elements. Therefore, the dead do not possess phrenes. It would appear that once you cross that threshold of the diaphragm, you have entered a state in which the phrenes cannot accompany. The only exception to this rule is the blind seer and prophet Tiresias. Alges's Divinus notes that Homer distinguishes between a free soul, which is the soul of a dead person, the psyche and the eidolon, and an embodied soul, which includes themos, nous, and menos, following an Egyptian pattern. In terms of Homeric morality, noble or good phrenes is a positive attribute toward your character, and having firm or empedoi or fitting phrenes is a sign that avoids poor behavior that is criticizable. One possesses crazed phrenes when one uses inappropriate speech, and you can be deceived in your phrenes when you've perceived a situation incorrectly. This is, of course, related to metis, which is the fluid state of awareness that allows you to cunningly navigate yourself in tricky situations, a famous trait that characterizes Odysseus. Wine has a negative effect on your phrenes, and as in the case with Polyphemus, it makes you dull and vulnerable, also inducing forgetfulness, excessive weeping, and acting inordinately through violence. When one is angry, phrenes can turn dark or black, either through an inner fire or blood. The expression in which phrenes, quote, have gone or departed is not necessarily indicative of physical absence, but that they're not functioning appropriately and admirably. It is important to note that the gods or other humans have the capability to destroy or harm or remove the phrenes. For example, in the Iliad, where Zeus harmed the phrenes of the Trojans, resulting in them fighting poorly in battle. Phrenes is also usually referred to at the beginning of an event or situation, and having ideas or words or objects placed in it result in some sort of action being taken as a consequence. Within Phrenes, we have even more specific psychological entities, specifically nous, ker, ethor, and thymos. When a person faints or dies, it is said that their ethor or thymos has departed. When one ponders, this is done thanks to ker, which is contained either within Phrenes or is enclosed by them. Nous in the Phrenes is equivalent with active thought, and ethor allows Hera and Athena to rage and Patroclus to become bold. Nous is possessed by the handmaidens of Hephaestus, who also possess speech, strength, and also they know the works of the immortal gods. Hephaestus is the metallurgical god who fashions using metals and uses his artisan skills and craftsmanship intimately with fire as his medium to mold, shape, harden, bake, destroy, and create. There are significant esoteric layers to the understanding of the role of Hephaestus in Greek cosmology that we cannot get into here, but let me reassure you that any conception you may have of the Greek pantheon and the divine attributes of the gods adopted and elaborated by our cultural imagination has very little to do with how the ancients understood and, more importantly, experienced them. We truly are an impoverished civilization. The less we understand the nature of the gods, the less we understand ourselves, and hence, the more we find respite in an externally outward-facing yearning and desiring for ephemeral and ultimately unsatisfying things, because our interior worlds remain bare and desiccated. A few summary points should be made regarding this one simple word phrenes, which opens countless subtleties of references and allusions. As fields of energy, like the Hindu chakras, they can be enhanced or harmed. Rarely does a person control phrenes. It's very much affected by the gods, although the decision boils down to choice on a somewhat personal level. Behavior of the person is entirely affected by the nature of their phrenes at any given moment. They act as subtle bodies, or as faculties indeterminately corporeal, and contain other specific psychological entities as a receptacle that is simultaneously a physical location and yet not a material one. This is just the beginning injunction of Empedocles' esoteric poem. The multiple layers of meaning and associations within this poem, combined with the actual structure of the poem, parallel and complement one another. This is an instance in which the medium is the message. The imparting of the knowledge to the poem's content is precisely the execution and performance of what it is conveying. Simply put, the cosmos is coming into being at the same time as Empedocles takes you on the journey reciting it. Take care for now.